open, look more, no hands, look ball, no frame, no shame. Numb me up like cocaine, can't focus, shaky can. Which moment makes a man? Cause I'm hoping it just begins.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Robert Groves, your host for the Groves Connection podcast. The Groves Connection brings you intimate conversations with pundits, providers, patients, leaders, and lay people, all to help us understand a contradiction. How can our healthcare system be both magnificent and yet so deeply flawed? We're going inside healthcare to talk candidly with those who know. What they have to say may delight, surprise, frustrate, or at times even anger you. But I invite you to get curious and listen to the truth about healthcare and those who want to fix it. Maybe the answers have been there all along. We just need to make the connection. Are you ready to connect? Ryan Campbell, welcome to the Groves Connection.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
I'm really fascinated by your story, and this is a little different than some of the other podcasts I've done, but I can't wait to get into this. But as is my habit, I'm curious about background. So can you take us back to where you grew up and what your life was like? And I don't know, are you Australian, or is that right?
Well, I'm based in Nashville in Tennessee, and
Okay, yeah.
I try and convince people I'm from West Texas. That's my main purpose in life these days. But no, I am an Aussie, and moved to the US 5 years ago, moved to Tennessee and in pursuit of the business and everything that we now do in the US. And but Aussie born and bred, and grew up in a small beach town in Australia, and just a normal Aussie family. Mate, dad was a truck driver and a farmer, and mum was a stay-at-home mum, and I was youngest of three boys. We were just kind of that typical middle-class family. Went to the same school for 13 years of my education, from kindergarten through to year 12, and my graduating class had 26 people. So, we were in kind of rural coastal Australia.
Yeah.
Honestly, the most incredible upbringing, the most incredible parents, most incredible family. We were given just enough. We were made to work for what we had, just enough, and it was just a beautiful balance.
Yeah. I'm struck by how, in many circumstances, I think it's the spin that we put on things in retrospect is critically important, and I'm reminded of how important it is to put our stories together of our past in a coherent manner. It's almost as if that's the scaffolding on which we build the rest of our lives, and without that, it can get a little chaotic. But talk to me about what kinds of things were on your mind then. Were you thinking about a career? Were you thinking about what you were going to do when you grew up, or thinking about going to additional school? How was your mindset at elementary school?
I definitely wasn't thinking about going to additional school, I can tell you that. I wasn't the biggest fan of school, but I was a big fan of aviation.
Gotcha.
And
okay.
I discovered my passion incredibly early in my life, and then that kind of fueled all the adventures, the good and the bad. And I was actually 6 years old. We jumped on a Boeing 737 in Sydney, and it was the very first time any of my family had ever been out of Australia and therefore overseas. So we all flew to a place called Vanuatu in the middle of the Pacific, a small island. And this was just prior, I am aging myself, but it was just prior to September 11. And
Yes.
that meant that from a security point of view, we were invited during that flight to walk up that aisle and actually go through the cockpit door. So we met the pilots, they turned around, they talked to the young boys, and that was it. I was sold, mate. Every day from that point on, I wanted to be a jumbo jet pilot. I wanted to grow up to, learn to fly airplanes. And I just lived and breathed anything to do with a flying machine.
So take us through, what was your first job? Was it in aviation, or was that always sort of the hobby on the side? How did that come together for you?
Yeah, so through a demand of wanting things, I had to get a job. That's all I wanted was a Fender Telecaster. And I remember putting this guitar on lay-by, and my cousin did exactly the same thing. We're the same age, and we both went out and got after-school jobs, and we both paid off the lay-by, probably 3/4 of it, and then our mum and dad paid the rest. That was that kind of reward and hard work thing. And once I had that guitar, I had a bit of spare money. I was earning $45 a week, and I was rich. So That's when I started to go down the road of flight training. I was 14 years old, working weekend jobs, after school jobs, and every 2 weeks I'd take a flying lesson.
Yeah.
That was the best part of my life. If I wasn't in the airplane learning to fly, I was reading about flying, or I was watching videos about flying, or that was my passion. And the performance that came as a result of the fuel that is a passion was pretty incredible. I was 14 years old learning to fly. I flew an airplane for the first time the day that I turned 15. My 15th birthday. So the first
was
day.
Was that a solo now? That was a solo flight?
First solo flight, 15th birthday.
Wow.
So first day I was legally allowed. I was let loose in an airplane, and 16 years old, I was flying passengers around, and 17, I had a private pilot's license. 18, I had a commercial pilot's license. So
wow.
It was everything. I was broke, but I was happy.
Yeah. So when you say you had a commercial pilot's license, what size airplanes were you flying at that point? What was it?
I mean, to start off, once I had a commercial pilot's license, that was basically just the approval to earn money as a pilot. So I started off flying scenic flights, and I would fly up and down the coast of Australia and take passengers flying. And it was a very poorly paid job, but I tell you what, it was a good job. So,
yeah.
As you know, my life took a unique turn when I was 17, and
yes,
decided to embark on an adventure of my own, an expedition. And
what did your parents say about this?
Well, to be honest, for the first few months, they didn't say anything because I didn't tell them. So for the listeners at home, I had a desire to become the youngest person and first teenager in history to have ever flown an airplane solo around the world, tiny single-engine airplane. And I knew a kid who did it at 23. Prior to that, the world record was 37. Like, more people had been to space and flown solo around the world. I had no money, but I was like, this is just, it epitomizes adventure. It epitomizes living. To break one of the few remaining records within aviation. So I actually Googled how to fly solo around the world, and I actually, from the secrecy of my bedroom, gathered some support from some very famous Australian names prior to telling my parents. And once this started to gather traction and a little bit more momentum than I first thought, I was like, oh my gosh, now I have to ask my parents. So I dried the dishes one night. My dad was next to me washing the dishes. Mum was sitting at the kitchen table. And I'll never forget asking the question. I was so incredibly nervous, mainly because I'd been planning this in secret, and I received some kind of supportive parental answer. Oh, that'd be a lot of fun. You'd see some amazing things. But then I sat down at the kitchen table and placed a folder of emails in front of them, and they started to read the emails that I'd been gathering. One email specifically from a very famous Australian man, and all of a sudden they went, "Oh, this is a bigger deal. This is not just
real." Yeah.
And good gosh, like, my parents that night jumped on board 2 feet first into a big black hole. None of us had any idea what we were getting ourselves into. Yeah, they're like, yep, we think this is cool. We'll support you. If you want to do it, we'll support you. It started 2 years of planning and training and preparing and fundraising. And I had to learn to fly at night and learn to fly in cloud. And we had to build a team, and we had to just everything from building a website to gathering sponsors. You know, we raised $250,000 on a laptop computer as a normal Aussie family. So really grassroots preparation, like grinding it out to make it work. We are just as proud, if not more proud, of the 2 years of planning than we are of the actual round the world flight itself.
I want to get into that just a little bit deeper so that for listeners and for me, so that I understand what's involved in the complexity of flying a small airplane around the world. And at some point, you're going to have to hop some oceans, right? And you've got to know what your range is and where you're going to refuel. What was the trickiest part of that planning, and how many stops did you have to make in that journey?
So it was an eastbound flight around the world from the Sydney area in Australia. 35 stops, 15 countries, 24,000 nautical miles. So the shortest leg on the trip was 20 minutes, a short hop in Wisconsin. The longest leg was Hawaii to California, 2,150 miles, 15 hours nonstop in a single engine airplane, 1,000 miles from dry land at the midpoint of that leg in any direction. And this is my point where I always say, I'm not recommending you do this. This was a
that
one and
sounds
done
pretty
thing,
scary.
Sure.
I didn't know a single engine aircraft could fly that far without refueling.
So we actually modified the airplane. So single engine airplane, if there's any listeners out there involved in aviation, it's called a Cirrus SR-22. You can look it up online, and it's a 4-seat piston powered propeller-driven aeroplane. It's designed to fly for about 5 or 6 hours before it runs out of fuel. That's its limit. So what we did was, obviously, as you mentioned, that's not enough to cross the ocean. So we took the back seat out of the airplane and we installed 160 gallons of fuel in a bladder tank, so a soft bag, in the back of the airplane. And all of a sudden, we're a flying fuel tank and we can fly for 17 hours nonstop without refueling. About 17 hours, a little less than 17 hours. It was hard to measure, but we had long-distance radio equipment, so a HF radio, a terrible quality radio, to talk to air traffic control from the middle of nowhere. We had ditch bags and we had life rafts and we had emergency pumps and everything for the fuel system. It's still not an airliner flying at 36,000 feet with a drinks trolley.
How high were you flying? That's a great question too. At what altitude did you fly typically?
We averaged 9,000 feet. So most legs were 9,000 feet. And that brings kind of a whole set of problems.
That's in the middle of the weather.
Well, and the forecasts for these kind of over ocean weather forecasts are not designed for people flying around at 9,000 feet, because any smart person is not flying around at 9,000 feet. They're all up at, flight levels with the airliners. So we had to kind of work around that. We had a lot of mentors, a lot of incredible people on an incredible team that lent a helping hand and shared wisdom and offered advice. And the goal wasn't to do this the quickest. It wasn't to do this with the most media attention or whatever. It was to do it safely.
Yeah.
I often say we took off, we landed, and we did this and we did that. And it confuses people when we deliver a keynote. Weren't you the only person in the airplane? And that's the perfect moment to talk about the power of the team. So
yeah. So and you accomplished this feat. And when was this? What year was this that you made this happen?
I took off on that round the world flight 10 years ago this month.
Hey Connectors, this is Alden from the Editing Bay. I just wanted to point out this episode was recorded in June 2023. So the date that Ryan is talking about is actually June 30th, 2013. Let's get back to the show.
70 days to go all the way around the world. We flew one day, stopped one day. We went from Sydney, for people interested in the route, island hopped across the Pacific into the west coast of the US, across the US up into Canada. We got ready for the crossing of the North Atlantic, which was a really big deal. So we flew over the tip of Greenland from Canada into Iceland, down to Scotland, England, France, Greece, had a diversion, meant to end up in Egypt, flew around Iraqi airspace, descended over the Red Sea, ended up in Jordan, flew 9 hours over Saudi Arabia to Oman, then down to Sri Lanka and across to Malaysia, Indonesia, and then back into the west coast of Australia. So finally,
unbelievable.
So yeah, crazy, a big trip.
Yeah, crazy is the word there. Were you, at any point in that journey, did you say to yourself, "What the heck am I doing? Why did I embark on this?" Was there fear? I mean, talk to us a little bit about the emotion of the journey.
The media and everyone, they're always just interested in the scary moments, right? So they always,
sure.
Did you ever think you're in trouble? We had a 60,000 foot thunderstorm over the Pacific. We had airframe icing over the North Atlantic. We had crisis in Egypt. We had airspace issues in Indonesia. So we had those moments. But from a mental health point of view, I think I landed in Greece, a Greek island called Rhodos, and a lady started to talk to me in broken English, and she was not happy that I was there. And we'd been so focused on the next destination, she started to get angry. She put me in the car, and I handed her all the paperwork. She took me to an office, and she really kind of got into me. And little did I realize, we had $10,000 of bribery cash hidden in that airplane. Yet I never put two and two together that maybe that's what she wanted. I didn't imagine that would happen in Greece. And I had a translator come in. We spoke with this lady, and she wanted me to leave, and we hid the airplane behind a building for 72 hours. And we came out 3 days later, and she was on the afternoon shift, and we left in the morning, right? So we kind of hid away from this lady. And it was at that point in time, kind of the beginning of not just that mess, but the beginning of a really hard section of the world. Everywhere from that point back to Australia was going to be challenging. And that's when I realized what pressure I had put on so many other people. They say adventure is a selfish thing, and ultimately that is correct. And it was at that point I was like, oh gosh, I just want this to go well. And
it would be unfair to not ask you, were there also moments of sheer joy as you were doing this journey, or was it all pretty much business?
Incredible moments. I watched the whole world. Coral atolls in the Pacific and lava spewing into the water at Hawaii. And we watched, sunrises and sunsets all over the world. We saw icebergs and deserts and the Alps, and I looked down on Indian fishing boats at night, and you name it, it was just wild. And in some ways, that was actually hard because I didn't have anyone to share it with. I had my life raft, which I named Bob.
Yeah.
Unless I'm talking to Bob, it was very hard to get other people to realize what you had experienced. And sharing something was actually kind of tough, to be honest. But
we are about relationships, aren't we? I mean, that's a good reminder that experiences are meant to be shared, with other human beings. I think that's very cool. Okay, so your life changed after that. I'm sure you were a celebrity of sorts, if not a big celebrity, particularly in Australia. Were you running around the country or the world then talking about your adventure? Or
it was incredible. It was unreal. I mean, I landed and we broke some world records, and I was the youngest person, first teenager in history to fly an airplane solo around the world. And you can see on the call the Guinness World Record on the wall. But to be honest, the world record didn't matter. I didn't care about it. Mum was the one who kind of forced me to submit the paperwork and make it official. What mattered was the impact we had, from 6-year-old kids all the way through to ex-World War II Spitfire pilots. Like, we had made a difference. Yeah. There was this impact that was pretty incredible. So we signed a book deal and wrote a book called Born to Fly, and that went out there, which was the story of the round the world flight. So that helped me share, the experience. And then I was invited to go and speak to different organizations. So I rocked up, told my story. They paid me. It was just a great little deal. And I met famous people. I shook the hand of Buzz Aldrin, a man who walked on the moon. I was invited to meet the royals. I had a meeting and kind of met with Prince William and talked about aviation and adventure with him. And then at a later date, I met with Prince Harry and talked about flying. I was invited to go to the Australian Museum, which is actually where I met Buzz Aldrin, and somehow was named one of Australia's 50 greatest explorers. And there are only 21 who are still with us. And that for me it's hard sometimes to realize if you've done something of significance. And that was a moment for me to go, wow, like, even though I don't feel like I deserve to be on that list, I am on that list and I'm proud of it. Yeah. So that was a massive highlight. So yes, my life was pretty incredible. But beyond all of that, I was just a normal Aussie kid who still was kind of in love with flying. So you talk about this dream of becoming a jumbo jet pilot. I'd had that dream since I was 6 years old. I was still flying for a living. I actually turned down a job with Qantas, which was my dream airline. To fly vintage airplanes. I was still a young guy. I was 21, and I thought, you know what? I'm not ready to go and drive the bus yet. I want to go and fly older aircraft, and I want to continue to build my experience as a pilot. And ultimately, that led to that day that changed everything.
And so how long a period was that when you were basking in the glow of a huge accomplishment, every reason to be proud, an amazing feat?
About 2 years and 3 months.
Okay.
So lots of adventure, and took another job flying, and kind of really continued to kind of live my life and start to look towards the next thing. So 2 years and 3 months.
Yeah. So now I want you to if you would, walk us through that day or night. I'm not sure what time of day it was and what you were thinking, and then what happened.
There was a day that changed everything for me, and it is tough. I've never delivered a keynote, not struggled, and it's raw and it's real. So just 2 years after the end of the round the world flight, I took a job flying warbirds, or vintage airplanes, and my job was to fly a open cockpit biplane that was built in the 1930s up and down the coast of Australia. So I'd fly up the beach with one person aboard the airplane at a time. So it was two of us on board. We'd fly up the beach, and if they wanted, at the end of it, if they were adventurous, we'd go upside down. So that was my job. Now, 28th of December 2015, so 7.5 years ago, it was a normal day at work. I met the gentleman who was flying with me first, and incredibly nice guy, had some aviation experience. We talked about flying. This airplane that we were about to ride in was just beautiful. It was a piece of art, and bright yellow biplane. And after talking, we went and climbed in the airplane. I helped him strap in. I started the airplane. So this was so old, this aircraft, that to start it, you actually grabbed hold of the propeller with your hand and you flicked it. And
oh my gosh.
It would start up. And this morning, it was actually the nicest this airplane had started for me. It was just beautiful. It purred to life, and sometimes they can be a bit temperamental. So it started beautifully. I pulled the chops from the airplane. I said goodbye to his daughter. I said, we won't be long. And we went and climbed in the airplane, taxied to the end of the runway and turned around. We lined up with the runway. It was the cross strip, so a grass airstrip. And I pushed the throttle forward and took off. And no records to break, no oceans to cross, any of that stuff. The airplane became airborne. We climbed past the end of the runway. The end of the runway disappeared beneath the nose of the airplane. And we lost power. So we had an engine failure. And I pushed the nose down and did everything I could in my experience, and I was a reasonably experienced young pilot at this point, to basically get to the best outcome that we possibly could. But it wasn't enough. And what resulted was a horrific accident and brutal, really brutal. It really is tough.
I can hear it in your voice even now. I mean, you're reliving this, yeah.
It's easy to tell an easy story. It's hard to tell a hard story.
Yeah.
But the hard stories are where the goods come from, So severe plane crash, so much so that I was cut from the wreckage, placed in a helicopter, flown to hospital as the only survivor. So that's the kicker in all of this is, I had 5 breaks in my back, shattered facial bones, shattered right ankle, broken talus, almost removed right ankle, cuts and bruises, head to toe, right orbital fracture, all titanium placed in my back, my right ankle reconstructed.
Yeah.
I shut down and was rebooted, and then I was sent across to ICU. I spent some time in ICU and then woke up sometime later in a recovery ward, and days had now passed. That's when I realized that I had a spinal cord injury, and I was diagnosed a complete paraplegic. So L1 down, no movement, no feeling, all the things that come with a spinal cord injury. But the hardest part about all of this was not that list of kind of problems or injuries, but the fact that I was the lucky one in all of this scenario. And that started me down on what was a very, very tough masterclass in mental health, in mindset, in resilience. And yeah, it was the lowest point of my life. And I hope it remains as the lowest point of my life. I hope it's worse than that. And yeah, 6 months in hospital in spinal rehabilitation ward, 1.5 years in rehabilitation as a whole, and a really long journey back to where we are today.
Well, I can't even imagine, especially at you're still a young man. I mean, you're a young man with your whole life before you, and to be faced with not only dealing with the aftermath of what had happened, and but then to be left to deal with the physical aspects of that. And the data is pretty clear that we all, to some extent, have a set level of happiness. It's not that it's not movable, but for the most part, we tend to have a set level of happiness. And whether you win the lottery or become paraplegic, if you make it through that, you get back to basically where you were before. What amazes me time after time, and I practiced as a critical care doc for decades, if you take one set of circumstances in 2 different people, the outcomes can be very, very different. And it's based on the way that they approach it. It really is. And I've watched that time after time.
That's the masterclass on mental health that I went through. It wasn't, oh, you have a sore back or you learn to walk again. I had a miraculous recovery from a spinal cord injury. Still lots wrong, but miraculous. But it wasn't that. It was being in a room, in a ward, living with the amazing healthcare professionals that saved all of us, but being with the other patients, watching a quadriplegic who had lost both his arms and become a quadriplegic, no movement or feeling from the chest down, have a better mindset than an incomplete paraplegic who learned to walk again.
Yeah.
Won the lottery when it came to a spinal cord injury recovery. That for me was just a wait a second. There is far more to this, to overall happiness and satisfaction in life, and to maintaining positive mental health. We were watching people go down the slippery slope to ultimately suicide and go down the road of just losing the will to live. And then we're looking at other people who thrive in the face of adversity. And then I just become so enamored by it, so interested in it, mainly because I had to understand my own mind.
Right.
Because that was what was going to determine how I ended up as a person and the rest of my life, quality of life. But then it became bigger than that. It was like, wait a second, the more I tell my bad story or struggle of a story, the more people show up and are willing to open up to me about their struggles. And now I'm seeing that everyone goes through adversity. It is a byproduct of breathing. So there should be nothing more important in life than, focusing on the ways that we can be better, the ways that we can look after ourselves and ultimately get to that point of happiness, whatever it is. That's the whole point of life, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
The mind is an incredible thing. Learning to walk for me was not a physical challenge. It was a mental challenge.
Mm. Interesting. So I love what you're saying about this, and it certainly is consistent with my experience. Can you give us a timeline of, was there a point at which you said, okay, enough of this, I'm going to focus on the positives and I'm going to get to work? Walk us through how that evolved for you and over what period of time and what happened next?
Yeah, so nurses, and we mentioned this before we started recording, nurses are the top of my tree. I just think, it's no disrespect to doctors, amazing. What you guys did for me behind the scenes were incredible. But the people who showed up to my bedside, helped me get dressed, I have to tell this story. I remember going to bed one night and a nurse, said, okay, close the curtains, good night, see you tomorrow. And I woke up, got back in the wheelchair, went out to eat the next morning, and that same nurse is still there. And I said I was like, you need to go home. Like, you need to sleep. Yeah. And she just smiled. She said, I've already been home. And she had finished a shift, gone back to her life, had her break, slept, got up, and she was back ready to look after us. And I was just like, that is the ultimate level of care. And when you're at that point in your life, I know that as a medical professional, you see a lot of people come through those doors and leave those doors in different, varying levels of success or whatever. But from a patient's point of view, there's only one person at that point, and therefore you as a team have so much impact on each individual person. So it was incredible to be in hospital, to be supported by the healthcare professionals that were around me. That began as just a patient lying in a bed, and every 2 hours the nurses would come in and roll me over to prevent bed sores. And then they started to lift me off the mattress in a sling, and they would leave me in the sling until the pain was too much. They put me back into bed. But every day I was hanging there for a little bit longer, and I was getting stronger and fitter. And it would become every day multiple sessions in the rehabilitation gym, a session in the hydrotherapy pool, patient education sessions to learn how to live with a spinal cord injury and all the loss of bowel and bladder and all that stuff that you just don't know about when you go into this situation in your life. But one session per week with a psychologist, 14, 15, 16 sessions a week on your physical health and one on your mental health. It was the most ridiculous imbalance.
Upside down.
It was just so wrong. It was so frustrating. So I was in a dark place. I was struggling. I remember a day they took me into the rehabilitation gym. It was actually the first time they ever took me in there in the wheelchair, and they laid me down on a bed and they told me that my first challenge was going to be learning to roll over. So, okay. I wasn't one to shy away from a challenge, didn't really think that this is where I would end up, but I came up with a plan. So I picked up one of my legs, I crossed my legs, I grabbed this bed and I pulled. But I had 5 breaks in my back. The pain from surgery was pretty immense and I'm pretty tough, but I stopped on my side and I lay on that bed, resting, waiting for the pain to go away. And so many people were looking at me, my parents, other patients' parents, nurses, physiotherapists, other patients. And I remember looking up to my right, and my right arm was all kind of twisted beside my body, and I looked under a gap beneath my elbow and I saw someone, and this someone would change my life. His name was Ben. He had slipped over. He was in his early 30s. He'd slipped over mopping his girlfriend's floor, hit his head, broken his neck, and he was a quadriplegic. So he had no movement, no feeling from his chest down, little movement or feeling, as you would know, in his arms and his hands. So Ben's sitting in this really big chair and he's got his arms, they're tied to the arm rests with elastic, and he's moving his arms in and out an inch at a time, right? That was Ben's exercise for the day. Here I was lying on a bed, feeling like my life was over, angry that I couldn't fly, sad that I couldn't walk, let alone go to the bathroom like normal. And I looked up at Ben and Ben looked at me. Now, we never exchanged a word in all of this, but when I looked up at Ben in this terrible place in my life, feeling sorry for myself, drowning in pessimism and self-pity, when I looked up at Ben, I realized what he would have given for one chance at rolling over.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I felt like the worst person on the face of the planet. And I had this really big guilt trip of how dare I? And we never said a word to each other. They put me back in the wheelchair and they took me back to the ward. But that was the beginning for me of understanding that the world wasn't against me, right? Adversity is a byproduct of breathing. It's an unavoidable element of the human experience. The world wasn't against me. I was merely experiencing what a lot of other people experience, albeit maybe a little bit worse. But, adversity is adversity. It's not a competition. So realizing that was actually the first step to normalizing.
Ooh.
And then that led to kind of okay, now I realize that no one's going to show up and make it go away for me because lots of people are in the same position. So what is it going to take for me to overcome? Well, that led to resilience. So then naturally I said, okay, well, how do we become resilient? Very process-based. That might be the pilot in me. And I realized as I asked myself, how was I going to become resilient, that moment with Ben, as I replayed it over and over again in my head, as I thought and talked about it and pondered on it and reflected on it, I realized that there are actually incredible resilience building tools hidden within that moment, even though we never exchanged a word, right?
Yeah.
But the more I dug into it, what was so powerful was the more I thought about it, the more tools I discovered. I started to focus on what I had left. So from my waist up, luckily, as opposed to what I'd lost from my waist down. And I started to focus and find gratitude in my ability to adapt, to find new ways to do old things, right? I rolled over, Ben couldn't roll over. So that was the foundation, the commitment to mindset, the commitment to mental health, and ultimately an understanding of adversity and a commitment to resilience were the two big things that were like, okay, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to become, I say turbulence tough. I'm going to become turbulence tough. And I'm going to use this storm to help me ride out tomorrow's storms because they're always going to come, right? They're always on the horizon. So that's what I did. And thankfully, spinal cord injury recovery, lots of people listening to your podcast will understand it's kind of a rehabilitation assisted lottery. So my numbers started to come out. We started to see a flicker of a toe, a twitch of a muscle, and a little bit of sensation returned. And after a bunch of work, I was able to stand up for the first time. And then a few seconds of standing turned into 10 to 20 to a minute. And then I was able to shuffle in this big walking frame, mainly using upper body strength, and the physiotherapist, amazing people, were moving my legs for me. And then I graduated to a kind of slightly smaller walking frame and solo shuffling. And after almost 6 months, just over 5 months in hospital, I went home for further rehabilitation in my wheelchair, which was purple with white wheels and sparkly paint. So I had a set of crutches with me, focused on getting onto the crutches. Not only did I make it to crutches, but I made it to walking. And I know you can't see me right now, but the way I explain it is I walk like I've had a few too many Tennessee whiskeys, right? If you imagine someone.
Gotcha.
But as incredible as, the recovery was, there was the other side of the seesaw, and that was I still can't feel my feet. I can't feel the backs of my legs or where I sit. I've got no calf muscles, no glute muscles, no plantar flexion or push in my feet. No roll control, no bladder, and no bowels. All of that is gone.
Yeah.
We could talk about that all day, but incredible to be able to walk and ultimately, get back to flying and do, albeit differently, and a lot of adaptation involved to pretty much live a pretty incredible life after it. So,
I think it's so important, Ryan, for providers to hear stories like this. Because it can become a bit of a grind sometimes to particularly working in rehab, and there's a tendency to get a little depressed about the state of the world. But to hear, and it was the same thing when I was practicing. Is one patient come up to me and say, "Do you know what a difference you made?" And that alone, could fuel me for months. Just that the experience of the patient. I think we don't hear that enough, and so thank you for sharing all that. I know it's difficult, even though you've practiced it. It's difficult still to go through all of that and deliver it, but it's so meaningful. And I know that you took it even a step further, and you decided that not only were you going to focus on finding those tools, but you found a way to share those tools with others through speaking and podcasts and whatever else. And how did that evolve? How did you go from where you were? You've started to identify tools that will help you get better. How did you make the transition to, hey, I want to share this?
There was a natural want to understand why. why do I feel this way? Why am I down? Why am I not happy? What do I need? What is it going to take? And I had some incredible help in hospital. Just people came out of the woodwork to help the kid who flew around the world. And I watched as I had a strong mind and still struggled. I watched people around me struggle beyond belief. And I left the hospital and I continued through rehabilitation. I got back to flying an airplane with special brakes or modified brakes. And so I was now flying airplanes again. And although I couldn't fly airliners or fly commercially, I got the opportunity to completely retrain as an incomplete paraplegic commercial helicopter pilot. So I became a helicopter pilot. And I was flying the helicopter one day. I landed, put the machine in the hangar, and I hopped in my car and I went down the street to get some groceries for dinner. So normal life, finally finding a new way forward, a fresh chapter in my life. And my dad was with me at the time. I said, my foot hurts, which was really weird because I can't feel my feet, right? So I took my shoe off and my shoe was full of blood. And this was in probably 2017, late 2017. And turns out I had a rock in my shoe, and that rock, I wasn't aware that it was.
You didn't feel it. Yeah.
So thankfully this didn't hurt, even though it's gruesome. But all day I sat in that helicopter with my feet vibrating on the floorboards, and that rock caused a lot of damage. And I ended up in a burns unit for 2 weeks and then back in that purple wheelchair for 2 months. And so even though I went back and finished my commercial helicopter license, and even though I still fly and have plenty of aspirations in the aviation world, I knew that what I had to share, this high versus low, and ultimately these tools far outweighed my unwillingness to want to share it. So that was the commitment I made to move all the way to America and leave my family behind. I sold everything I owned except that little airplane that got me back into the sky, and that airplane now lives with me here in Tennessee. We fly it all the time. I moved to America and I jumped on the keynote speaking circuit, and I mean, speaking petrifies me like most people, but it was important to share the message. You mentioned it there before, like you guys, everything that you do in your industry, you change the world one patient at a time. And that's not some corny cliche, that's the truth. And I think everyone needs some help. We live in a world that's so fast paced and stressful, and we all go, feeling like we need to show up and do more to be more. And we're seeing a real effect on mental health, and we're seeing a decline in happiness and satisfaction and joy and all of these kind of quality foundational kind of elements of life. I didn't even realize as I moved to America that my greatest lesson, as I call it, had still yet to be learned. And everyone wants to hear about the round the world flight story and the accident story and these big chapters of my life. And I was here in America on the keynote speaking circuit sharing them, and I was still struggling. So I was kind of just in this, I had everything that society said I needed to be happy. I had an incredible recovery. I had this amazing yellow airplane. I had recently traveled to Graceland in Memphis, the home of Elvis Presley, fell in love with that whole idea, bought a model pink Cadillac for $30 at the gift shop. They kind of force you through the gift shop in America.
Yes, they do.
You can't get out until you go through the gift shop. So I bought a model pink Cadillac and went on 9 months later, as we tell the story, to buy the real thing. I actually purchased the typical kind of foreigner in America, the American dream. I spent all the money I had on a 19-foot long, 2.5-ton 1960 pink Cadillac. So I've got this pink Cadillac and this yellow airplane and all these things where I thought I needed to be happy and I wasn't happy. And the most important story of my life was I hopped in that car and I took it down the street one day. I just had to run some errands and do some jobs. And I pulled up at a gas station and saw an old man, and this old man was staring at this pink Cadillac. And he was pretty old, and he just had the biggest grin on his face. Like, if he smiled any harder, his ears would have touched behind his head, right? This man was happy. And I looked up at him, and I was stuck in my normal rut of work and whatever, and I happened to be driving this car, but I looked at him, and I saw his smile, and he waved at me, and he walked away. And I got out of the Cadillac, and I sat on the trunk of it as I filled the gas tank, and I thought to myself, I mean, every weekend we drove the car, people had come up to it. I've never seen a machine that evokes so much emotion. They want to take photos. People want to sit in the car, sit on the car. They ask questions. When was the car made? Oh, it was made in 1960. Do you work for Mary Kay is my favorite question. No, I did not work for Mary Kay. But so this car had all these incredible reactions, and we saw it all the time. People would honk and scream from a moving vehicle. But this old man was different. He just kind of waved, and then he smiled and he walked away. And as I sat there thinking about him, I realized that I had no idea what he was going through in his life. but I knew by definition that he was going through something because we all are. And I thought to myself, well, whether it's a sore back or his wife had given him a long job list, or whether it's a recent loss of a loved one or a cancer diagnosis, it didn't matter, because adversity, again, is not a competition. What mattered was that he was going through something. Again, we all are. That's so important. But when he looked at that pink Cadillac and when he smiled and when he thought about that car for the rest of that day, all of his worries, whatever they were, went away. They disappeared into irrelevancy just for a moment. And I thought, man, that's a powerful thing.
Yeah.
Because I'm a keynote speaker. I'm talking on resilience. I'm out there looking for the tools to help me. And this pink car, this idea of just smiling, is that really the answer? And it kind of took me on my own journey in life where I started to kind of prioritize the things that made me smile like a kid. And I'd had a jet ski and we'd go on adventures and I'd hang out with my friends. I had this airplane, this car. I've had all these incredible hobbies. I had them my whole life, but I'd never thought about why I did them. I'd never really thought about the benefits of doing them. So what I was doing was I wasn't actually doing anything new, but what I was doing was I was doing the same things with a new understanding of why I was doing them. So every time I struggled in my life, every time I was having a bad day, I decided to prioritize joy. I prioritized the things that made me smile. So if I was having a bad day, I might go and get a milkshake, or I might go for a walk by the river, or go and have a beer with a friend. And I did it with the understanding that this stuff actually mattered. We often see the things we do for ourselves as selfish when ultimately they're essential. So that understanding made me realize they were essential. That gave me permission to do them. That permission led to prioritization, which is ultimately action. That led to positive change. So just by shifting what I prioritized in my life and focusing on the things that gave me joy and made me happy, I became a much better person, and I showed up better in kind of all areas of my life. And I'll say this because I can see you've got a thought. I don't want anyone out there to believe, regardless of what we're told, sold, or influenced, or led to believe every day, that there is a golden egg to make all your problems go away. I don't care what 5 steps you get sold in a book or what online course there is, just stop it. Like, there is no golden egg to make your problems go away. So instead of chasing that golden egg tirelessly, like a kind of a greyhound at a racetrack, I encourage people to stop looking for the ultimate solution and start stepping back, prioritizing yourself so you can show up better in the face of all those unavoidable challenges, because they'll be there until the day that you die. So this whole idea of prioritizing joy, which I saw in my own life, gave me, it was an incredible, it was a missing puzzle piece for me, right? And I saw an immense improvement in my mental health. That was something that we then tacked onto the end of the keynote for 5 minutes. At the end of every keynote, we asked this ridiculous question, what's your pink Cadillac? And we watched this conversation grow like wildfire. And that's what I will say. I'll breathe for a second, but I'm very passionate about it. That is what has led us to this point right now where we talk about not just pink Cadillacs, but more importantly, prioritizing joy.
Yes, I love that. And what a brilliant insight. And because we're all taught, and we know from, even the lay literature that, you don't have control over what happens to you, but you can control how you respond to it. You can, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative. But the question that always comes up is how? How do I make that happen? And you have identified a toolkit that allows you to do that, and you're sharing it with others, and so that they get the idea that it can allow them to do it too. Is that how you see it? Am I on the right track here?
Yeah, and I think I had this massive kind of moment in my life where I realized finally what a speaker or a communicator or a leader does. They don't provide anything new. We don't need new ways to solve all problems. They're all out there for the taking. What we need is a new way to have the conversation. We need a way to have a work-life balance conversation without saying the words work-life balance. We need a clever, viral way to get people to buy in to a solution or a tool so that they gather a new understanding that leads to permission, prioritization, and positive change, right? That's the whole point of it. The pink Cadillac, for me, I fell into it because I actually had a real pink Cadillac.
Yes.
But when we first started asking people, what's your pink Cadillac? The most important word was your, because I can say to you, hey, Robert, what's your pink Cadillac? And then all of a sudden you start talking about like your days at the lake, or the fact that you have an old car in your garage, or you love collecting vintage surfboards, or, and man, have we heard some weird ones, right? Like whatever brings you joy might be my worst nightmare, right? I might hate skydiving, you might love skydiving. So by asking the question, we're able to allow every individual, whether it's somebody that works within a ward or within a hospital or within a team or whatever, we're allowing, and this is a question that everyone can ask their people, we're allowing the conversation to be personalized to the individual. And that's a really, really hard thing to do. If you don't do it, you don't get relevancy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The story is the buy-in for us. You know, we want to tell the story of the high and low. If I can turn around and tell you that the greatest resilience building tool I've ever discovered was not learned during a world record breaking expedition, it was not discovered in a spinal cord injury ward or in the process of learning to walk and fly again, it was parked in my driveway. Like, it's so frustrating. So frustrating. If I can tell you that, then that must, I hope, communicate the weight and the importance of this accessible, attainable change. You know, what is the point of what we're doing here?
Yeah.
Just living in general. We just want to laugh. We want to have fun. We want to smile like a kid. There's a statistic from a study. It was 12,000 business leaders and consumers. It's my favorite statistic, and that's coming from a man who doesn't really love too many statistics. And they looked at 12,000 people. They found that 45% had not felt true happiness in more than 2 years.
Oh.
25% had lost an understanding or didn't really know what it even meant to feel true happiness. And as soon as I saw that statistic, it just became the center point of everything that we do, because that's just not good enough. That's just not good enough. We've lost the pure essence of life. And I don't know whether it's the rat race world we live in, the distractions of social media and this fast-paced kind of, you know, your grass is always greener world. I'm not sure, but we need to stop. We need to find balance. We need to step back so that we can show up better. And if there is any industry in this world that not only do I love speaking to most is, you know, that's the healthcare industry, but if there's any industry that needs it, we need all of you to show up better, to show up in, let's say, in your best form, because that's what allows you to change the lives of every single patient in the same way that you changed my life. And, you know, if that means going for a walk on the beach or having a Friday night glass of wine, or if that means an organization gives a little bit more time off or incentivizes self-care, then we need to have the conversation and create the change, because it matters.
Yeah, you know, I'd love this. I absolutely love what you're doing and what you're saying. And my thoughts immediately went to there's a little bit of backlash in the nursing and medical community about, don't talk to me about resilience. You need to change your business model. And the problem is that both are true, but my bias is that you can't have a healthy culture without mental health in each individual in that culture. They don't all have to get it right, but you have to have overwhelming majority of people who understand themselves well enough to be able to modulate that with the right tools. And the way you deliver it becomes so simple and so clear, and the tool's right there in front of us. You know, we just hadn't recognized that tool is sitting there waiting to be leveraged, so that not only can we make our lives better, but we show up better for everyone in our lives. And that's the way real change happens. You know, it's a contagion, a positive contagion in this circumstance. And so I really want to say I appreciate what you do. And my Pink Cadillac is having conversations like this with people like you. It's what brings me great joy. And I just want to thank you so much for your time. You've been very generous. I guess the last question, possibly the last question that I want to ask you is, where are you taking it from here? What's your life plan now? What are your goals? Where are you going?
Well, I'm a very old 29, so for me, I'm recently married and bought our first home, and you know, kind of living that.
Congratulations!
I appreciate that. You know, we have all the things planned that you plan at this age. You want to have a family and do all of that stuff, but never did I imagine I'd be in America and having a conversation about a pink car wearing a pink t-shirt. But and this is so important to me, and I'm so fired up and inspired and motivated by the response that we get from this conversation. So as a full-time keynote speaker, that's what we do. You know, we speak to all sorts of industries from all walks of life, you know, all different ages, and we have this conversation. We start the conversation, we ask the question, and we hopefully leave an impact as we walk out that door. And I'm excited to watch it grow. I want to see it grow into, you know, a program of accountability online that we can share within employees and workplaces. And I want to see weekly videos get dropped into inboxes just as a reminder to go and do those things throughout your week. And I want to see a shift to where your comment of, well, we don't really need resilience, becomes a want and a desire to build resilience. You have to be proud of your ability to get back up. That is what makes great people great. And if the only reason that you could justify a lack or no need for resilience is if you don't truly understand adversity. Once we agree that it's a byproduct of breathing, then all of a sudden, if you're breathing, I got bad news, you better build resilience. So then the question becomes how, and, you know, after all of the heartache and the things that I've gone through in my life, accessible, attainable change lies in the simplest of things. And, you know, I'm excited to just be the person to have that conversation. We're writing a book called What's Your Pink Cadillac? The hidden power in our hobbies, interests, and simple pleasures. So we are taking this conversation out there, and I will say to everyone out there listening and to you, the only way we get to do this is through word of mouth. And, you know, there are so many people out there who need to have this conversation, and it's the hardest part is just, you know, kind of seeing the doors and getting through the door. And, you know, so if you know of anyone, or, you know, please reach out, please. We'd love to help. We'd love to be there.
And so tell us, where can people find you if they're interested in following along and you know, getting this story from a number of angles and maybe asking you to speak for them? How do they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So jump online. It's ryancampbell.co, and that's not .com. I always tell people we can't afford the .com yet, right? So ryancampbell.co, or just email me directly, ryan@ryancampbell.co. Any major speaker bureau, you can book and request us through. And please reach out and have the conversation. Jump on socials, Instagram and LinkedIn at Ryan Campbell Speaking. And we share lots of content, and we start the conversations on different platforms. So with that in mind, I thank you for having me on here today and giving me a voice and an opportunity to talk about the Pink Cadillac.
And well, the pleasure has been all mine. I owe a thank you to Pete Simmons, who is on our Baylor Aetna board, for introducing us. I understand why he was so excited about this introduction now. And with that, we're going to wrap up for today, but I'm going to follow along now. I'm going to watch this journey, and I'm going to use those tools. And thank you for providing me with the Pink Cadillac today.
Yeah, more than welcome. Thanks for having me.
Okay, bye-bye. You've been listening to The Groves Connection, your connection to the inside story on healthcare, featuring in-depth interviews with those who know. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, give us a 5-star review to keep the connection going, and hit the subscribe button to be sure you never miss a beat. The Groves Connection is produced by Dr. Robert Groves. Original music, editing, and creative direction provided by Alden Groves. Production support, content guidance, courtesy of Janae Sharp and Elizabeth Barrett. Thank you for listening. The professional ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast are mine and do not reflect those of any current or past employers. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time on The Groves Connection.